What is that book of poems competing with? Well, it's competing with people with their kids, what's on TV. It's competing with, the reality is, the more that you can lean in to the deviation, the zag, the more you realize there really is no competition. What associations do you want people to have with you and with your art? If you are trying to turn your poetry into a vehicle for impact and change in other people's lives, then this is going to help. We have here Marty Neumeier's Zag, and this is going to be a textbook that we're going to be using for this edition of the Creative Companionship. Welcome, guys. This is the Diversus Book Club, where we take a look at texts that are very often in relation to business or creative business, and then we talk about how can we apply some of the concepts from this textbook over into our own creative work. And to guide you in this process, there, of course, is me. Hello, guys. My name is Jeff with an O, and I am a poet here to help you live on poetry. I picked this book, Zag, because this is going to be a book that's going to be dedicated especially around concepts like branding, but perhaps more importantly, it's really about differentiation. How can you separate yourself from others in the field? The way that this book club works is I have been reading the text, I've taken some notes, and from those notes, I arrive at 4 or 5 questions that we're going to be trying to answer. I'm going to approach it from the Diversus perspective, but for you, I would encourage you to ask yourself, hey, how can I take these things that Jeff is talking about, that the book is talking about, and apply it to my own art? You don't have to use it the same way. To give some background as well for Diversus and myself. So I'm approaching poetry as a vehicle for communication exercises. I'm also using poetry as a vehicle for personal development for poets, and also to give poets ideas on how to create a platform around their poetry. So those are kind of the 3 angles I'm using. You may be a poet who's asking, hey, maybe I can use poems as devices for marketing for other companies, or maybe I can use it to create curricula for schools, or maybe I can use poetry as a vehicle to create, who knows, some sort of programming, like after school programming for kids or teenagers. Whatever the case may be, these are going to be some of the central ideas. The big thing, if I had to summarize a central concept from this whole book, is probably the idea of radical differentiation. We cannot do the thing that other poets are doing, and we're going to try to address that, especially in some of the latter questions that we'll get to. So let's begin with a first question based off the book. And this question is, what are all the things that your art competes with? If you're a poet, what are some things that your poems are competing with? Well, first and foremost, if you're doing submissions, or if you're doing contests, if you're applying for grants, things like that. So your competition is other poems. Your competition is other poets. If you're applying for grants, your competition is other arts organizations and other artists. But it's bigger than that too, right? Because you're competing for other people's attention. So for instance, let's say that you put out a book of poems. What is that book of poems competing with? Well, it's competing with people with their kids and time spending with kids and your families. It's competing with what's on TV. It's competing with movies. It's competing with hanging out with friends. It's competing with cooking dinner. It's competing with sleep. Like there's all these things that you're competing with that are well beyond what the actual product is or whatever it is that you've created. So we have to really kind of ask ourselves what you're competing with. For Diversus, in addition to all of those things, a lot of things that I'm creating in terms of, especially for instance, like in the personal development thing, in that arena, you're competing with, for instance, mindset. A lot of poets aren't used to the idea of thinking about, hey, I want to take my art to a professional level. Well, if you never even thought of that, you're not even aware of how to search for it. You never thought of it. It never comes up, right? So it's competing with people's perceptions of how the art works. It's competing with even aspects like scarcity mindset versus abundance mindset. Like, oh, like this workshop costs $20. Well, that's a dinner. right? Or just the education in general, right? It's not free, and I think it's something that very often we know is valuable, but we also see more immediate needs. We think of like Maslow's hierarchy, where a lot of times that money is going to the lower level stuff, right? It's going to maybe hanging out with friends or food at the bar or the restaurant or paying a bill, right? It's not necessarily thinking about, oh, if I invest this money here and learn the skill, then I can bring that money back. I can always make more, right? So all these things, when Diverse is offering things that cost money, that cost more money, and it also costs more time, a lot of artists aren't necessarily thinking about putting down for that investment, right? So in addition to all those other time things, there's also kind of the mindset things that come into it too. And so that's the first question I would encourage you to think about based on this book. Make a list of maybe 5, 10, 15 different things that you think your art immediately is in competition with. Once you have that list, the next question I would ask you is, what associations do you want people to have with you and with your art? If we just go around saying, hey, I'm a poet, that's not necessarily a whole lot of information to work with. People are going to be thinking like Shakespeare, or people are going to be thinking like slam poetry and open mics and things like that. So the more that you can lean into, for instance, in Columbus, I know a couple of poets who are big into like social issues. You know, so when they make poems, when they make collections, it's about that. I know poets who make collections that are related to health issues, right? So all the collections that they do are in the lens of coming to terms with an illness. There's also familial things. Like, for instance, a lot of my poems are doing like dad poems, right? That's the big thing. That when people see me and they hear poems, they're like, oh, Jeff's probably going to be doing one of his dad poems again. And these are things that you can deviate from at times, but kind of like, what is the central focus that keeps reoccurring in your work? One of the dangers of this, too, is if you're just like, oh, I just write poetry. Well, people are going to be attaching lenses onto it anyways. They're going to create their own associations for you if you don't claim them yourself. And you can't force people to think of, you know, how you want them to perceive you. They're going to make their own judgments. But what you can do is you can feed them different inputs to continuously guide them in the direction that you want them to lean. And it's not going to work 100%, but it's going to have much greater success than if you just let people form their own associations on their own without really even considering the direction it's going to take. From Diverse's, the perspective of the company here, the big association is the concept of living on poetry, independent poetry, full poets against starving artists. You know, these are the key concepts. If you look at all our posts, we're talking about ways to approach your art from a professional standpoint, from a standpoint of creating a business, from a standpoint of using poetry to solve other people's problems. Everything we post is coming through that lens. You can check it on the social media feeds. You can see it in the video podcast. We have arts and offers, right? Everything is consistent. So that way when people think of Diverses, that's the lens. And then they can also choose to align with it or to stay away from it. But it makes it easier because they already have in mind, oh, they do this, I'm either for that or I'm against that. So then they can make a choice. So now that you've taken some time to think about what are your associations, or what associations do people have with your art, and you've also taken some time to think about the competition that your art is in, potentially, the next question that you really want to be asking yourself is, how does someone take a traditional path in your industry? So let's talk about the poetry world. So in the poetry world, the way things typically work is, if a poet wants to make a traditional career path in poetry, they write poems, they edit the poems, or they may go the slam route. And in that case, the editing is for kind of that stage audience. If it's the page, you're doing it more traditional. Then you're going to be doing more publishing, building up your credentials either way. Then at some point, very often, people are pursuing more education. So you get like your MFA in poetry. Then after that, you're trying to fight for academic type jobs. A lot of times it's adjunct professor positions, college positions. In the past, it was like tenure track, although that seems to be going away and things like that, right? This was the traditional path. If you're like, oh, I live on poetry. Well, it's like, kinda. Even if you get like the professor job, there's requirements expected of you, in terms of what you create isn't necessarily on your own terms, right? There's research you have to do, there's things you have to uphold that the administration puts on you and things like that. So it's not entirely on your own terms, but it is a career path in poetry. So that's the traditional path there. Something that if you're watching this and you're thinking about how can I apply again this book to my own life, is think about, for what you want to do, what's the traditional path look like? Once you have that traditional path, the next question is to ask yourself, how can you deviate from that? For my own life, I used to do the traditional path. I was doing lots of submissions. I got the fellowships. I never got the MFA, but aside from an MFA, I'm doing all the other things that traditional poets are doing. I got a lot of credentials. I'm very, very happy with them. I'm glad it happened. But one of the things that indirectly launched the Verses a few years later was I was sending out these chapbooks and these chapbook submissions, and it got rejected at the finalist stage twice in the span of about 2 months. And one of the things I realized was that it was the same judge for both contests. So, here's a manuscript that twice is beating out, hundreds of other manuscripts. It's ending up in the top 10, and both times getting rejected by the same judge. And in a lot of ways, I'm very thankful for that, because it made me question. It's like, oh, why am I leaving the future of my art up to a stranger who doesn't know me, doesn't know my art, doesn't know what I do, doesn't know my goals and things like that? I'm leaving my artistic future, this manuscript, this book, this collection, I'm leaving it up to this other person to decide if it's going to make it to market or not. I didn't like that. I don't like leaving things that I can't control in the hands of other people so that I no longer control it, right? And so that's part of what spurred the Verses, is like, hey, let's take control of our art. Let's live on our art in a way that we dictate, So that made me question, what does that look like? Well, that looks like, for instance, how are we deviating? Like, look, I'm literally in a space I rent for poetry. This is the only poetry dedicated space in the city. One of the things is, like, on the window right behind that camera, I have posted up there issues of a magazine I call Brick and Mortar, where it's a non-print, it's a non-online poetry journal. I regularly host workshops through the Poet Business Institute, workshops you can see here on the channel, dedicated to talking about discussions around business and art. I have the podcast, right? Arts and Offers video podcast, again, talking about business and art. All of these things, I organize retreats. The list goes on and on and on. I organized the first poetry conference in the city. This is the deviation. Poets aren't doing that. So now what this does is it allows me to create a name for myself, because, look, there's big poets in this city. There's poets already in those top positions. However, none of them are doing the same things I'm doing. So it allows me to create my own avenue, because in reality, one of the very first questions I asked you was, what is your art competing with? The reality is, the more that you can lean in to the deviation, the zag, the more you realize there really is no competition. Yes, there are other poets doing big things, and that's great for them. Happy for them. But none of them are doing what I'm doing, or is going to be as big as me as what I'm doing. It's not possible. The final question I would have for you, taken again from Marty Neumeier's Zag, which I encourage you to check out. It's been a very helpful read. We'll be talking about it in the next edition of the Creative Companionship Book Club as well. Is this: what is a good but not different poetry product? He has this chart in the book. He has lots of charts in this book. He's a designer, so when he's making this book, he's doing things like, has like all black pages, lots of images. There's some graphs and things like that, infographics. One of the things that he has is this chart that shows a spectrum. And these 4 different quadrants are talking about, there's good but not different, there's good and different, there's not good and not different, and there's different but not good. So this is the chart that he has. And the problem with having something that is good but not different. The way I think about this for poetry is I think of, for instance, like a poetry book. What do poets do? What's a product that most poets make? If they make a product, it's a book. They put a book out into the world. Here's the issue. A book is going to do well in tests. Like if you had a focus group or if you asked people about poetry books, it's probably going to do well because it's something that people expect. And because people expect it, it goes to market very, very easily. People are used to seeing books. They're used to hearing about bookstores and libraries, right? It generates incremental profits until challenged by competitors. Think about your friends that like put a book out and like it wins a contest and there's that like initial launch and it does really, really well at first. How's that book doing, 5 years later, 10 years later? Is it sustaining that momentum or is it slowed down a lot? It earns small market share. What's the likelihood of that book being, out of all, if 100 poetry books are bought, how many of those poetry books are going to be yours? How many of the books in general are going to be yours, right? Like this market share is going to be relatively small, right? Some brand potential. You can make a name off a book, potentially. Okay, it's difficult to do, and it's hard to sustain that, but it's possible. Hopefully the thing that you're noticing is that this route, by having a traditional path, is challenging. It's challenging because, again, it's not zagging. It's hard to differentiate. There's going to be lots of other things you're competing with. The direction that Marty wants us to move towards is good and different. So if good but not different is here, we want something ideally that can be good and different. Now, here's the thing about it. It's not going to do well if you test it. Like if you ask people, are you interested in this? People are probably going to say no because they're not used to it. It's new. They're nervous. We've talked before about, like, for instance, like the chasm. There's an idea of you need like your early adopters, people who are willing to, or honestly, pursue something because it is new, right? Those are the people you're going after. Your general population, your mainstream audience, they're going to kind of stay away from it because they don't trust it, right? So for instance, like the verses, like having a space, doing more workshops around poetry and business and things like that. These things are new for people. So there's a lot of hesitancy at first, right? The goal is that customers eventually will equate different with good. They slowly start to trust it and see the quality of the work. What this can do, if it's successful, is it can generate lasting profits because there's nothing else really like it. So it's something that can endure after that 5-year mark. The book might disappear, but the program or organization who runs the workshops and things like that, that could be a name that no one else in the city really can run with. It can earn a larger market share, and it has a strong brand potential because people begin associating you with that new, radically different thing. Now, the chances of that being successful can be really, really challenging. There's a risk here. What I tell people is that, hey, we are sailing to an island that may not exist. There's a chance that everything we're talking about is going to fail. There's a chance that the money I'm investing in this space isn't going to work out. But the only way we can truly know is by trying. So those are the 4 questions I'd like you to consider. Let me know in the comments your own answers to these. Let's take a look at part 2. Good morning, guys. Good evening. Good afternoon. My name is Jeff with an O. I'm a poet, and I'm here to help you read through this book while applying the concepts to poetry. I have more questions. We're going to be looking at about 4 or 5 more questions that you can use to ask yourself that hopefully can help you take your art to a professional level in addition to that creative level. So we're going to be starting with this question here. Something that we talk a lot about on the channel is this concept of poetry and this is going to be your unifier. This is going to be the thing that creates your uniqueness. This is going to be a thing that people are going to listen to and be like, yes, I identify with this, or no, I don't identify with that, which is good. We need that differentiation. So some questions to be thinking about. Think about another passion that you have beyond art, something else that interests you. Once you have that in mind, I want you to begin thinking about what are some problems that people with this passion have that you think art or poetry can be used for to solve. I again will turn to an example. So I don't do this as much with diverses, although we do have a communication branch called Magnet Lab. And Magnet Lab is a communication program that for the moment is mostly filled with students from my communication business. And what we do is, well, really the whole point of Magnet Lab stands for magnetic expression. We are trying to speak in a way that draws people to us. And this is linked to how I tie poetry into communication. So in my main teaching business, when I'm working with clients, I am very intentional because these are clients that very often aren't feeling as confident with their communication skills. These are clients who want to become more expressive. These are clients who oftentimes struggle to convey more of the emotional aspects of language. These are clients who are working on things like pronunciation and accent, but also ways to link, ways to sound more natural in their speech, and to become people that honestly aren't invisible when they talk, but are actually people that other people want to listen to. So that's a passion I have. I'm very interested in communication. I got my degree in ESL, teaching English as a second language. I'm a language learner myself. I was an Italian major in school. I lived abroad for a year. So these are things that I'm interested in. I'm interested in languages. I'm interested in communication. I'm interested in expression in addition to poetry. And I just listed again some of the problems that they have. So you want to kind of be thinking about the same thing for passions that you have. Once you have that done, the next question I would encourage you to think about is notice what's going on in either the worlds of your passion or even the larger world in general, and try to identify some trends that you think you can hop on. Let's again go from the diverses angle. So some trends that I am noticing. One, when I look at art, I see a lot of artists who are nervous. There's poets that have the assumption that you can't live on poetry. There are poets and writers who are really nervous about the rise of AI and how AI is going to affect them in their art. There are a lot of poets who are struggling professionally with jobs, taking relatively low paying jobs that don't tap into their creativity. These are contractor jobs, so people don't have access to jobs that are salaried. If people are working in education, they're adjunct professors without realistic hopes of getting tenure track. So there's some professional struggles. So what is Diverses doing? Well, Diverses is proposing, hey, instead of being reliant on bosses, that you create terms for work that you don't control. Maybe you can create the thing yourself. It pairs also with the movement towards work from home and remote work, because if you work for yourself, you can dictate where you do the work from, right? It also creates freedom with art. You're finding ways to not compete with other artists. You're finding ways to not compete with AI, because another trend I see with artists is there's almost like this anti-capitalist, anti-exploitative move. And so when you create your own job, you're able to operate in a way that you understand the dynamics of it. You create how quote unquote capitalistic it is. You or philanthropic or altruistic it is. You control all of those terms and situations. So that's an example of some of the trends that I think Diverses is trying to piggyback on. You want to find a trend because, as Marty Neumeier says, when you're able to find a trend, it's going to make the work a bit easier. Okay. He gives some other examples as well. Okay, so he points to Starbucks. So what's Starbucks appealing to? Well, Starbucks is appealing to a look for sophistication, a more European lifestyle for people. He looks at Apple pushing people towards feeling creative, artistic. having quality and sophistication to them as well. Trader Joe's he points to for the organic living, trusting where the food's coming from, paying attention to how the food reaches you, and things like fair trade. So those are just some examples that they have. In terms of a piece of advice that Marty provides, he gives this story to us talking about your mom, talking about his mom. He had a conversation with his mom, and his mom asked him, how do you see your future? And what does he say? He says, like, well, I'm not really sure what direction to take. And her response is, well, you have to find a parade and you got to get in front of it. This is the idea of the trend. We have to find out what's happening in the world around us and how can we jump ahead of it. Because if you don't find the trend, it can be still possible to move forward, but it's hard to pick up from the zeitgeist of everything else that's happening around you. So it just can become a lot more labor intensive to move forward. So finding the trend for what you want, that's connected to your passion, that's connected to your art. I have 2 more questions for you to be considering. In exercise, one of the things that Marty does in the book, we're getting to right around page 50 in the book, and right at this moment, he starts to give you a checklist of things to basically help you design a zag. Again, the name of the book is Zag. It's about differentiation, radical differentiation. How do you separate yourself? That's what this is about. So he's got 17 points that we're going to be exploring one by one today, and then in future episodes of Creative Companionship. The very first point is trying to determine who you are, and the exercise that he proposes to help you do this is create your professional obituary. So imagine that you create a business around your poetry. What would the obituary for that business look like? Imagine that you ran the business and it was successful and then you had to shut it down for whatever reason. What do you want to be included in that obituary? I'm thinking about for Diversus, some things that I want. I would like to guide at least 100,000 poets to creative and financial independence. I would like to create an actual center, ideally in a physical building, in addition to our online video arm, where people can learn all the aspects that they need to live independently through poetry. It would need to have an education arm. It would need to have a media content producing arm. It would need to have a craft arm to develop people. And it would also need to have an arm to guide people in expression and development and communication in that regard. So that's real quick, like the big picture thing. And you can incorporate more specifics about like location, talk more about the impact that you have on people, how long you existed for, how many branches did you have, how many people did you employ. Like these are all the things that you can be thinking of for creating your own obituary, but hopefully that kind of gives you an idea of some things that if I had to do that exercise for Diversus, what that would look like. The final thing we're going to talk about today, this is the next checkpoint in his book, and the checkpoint is called What Do You Do? And the central idea here is trying to identify what is your actual purpose. Okay, so once you make the decision to go professional with your art and not only create independently, you're also creating for other people. Why are you doing it? And you have to be really honest about your purpose. So part of the reason I'm doing it is because on an individual level, I found that I didn't have control over my art. I didn't have control over where it was accepted or rejected. I've told the story again. For instance, I was sending out a chapbook. It was a finalist in 2 different competitions in the span of 4 months. Both those competitions had the same judge. It got rejected both times. So it's a manuscript that's beating out hundreds of other manuscripts, thousands of other manuscripts, and then it's getting rejected at the final step by the same person over and over again. And I was like, hey, I don't want to live like this. I don't want my art to be determined, or I don't want my art's success to be determined by other people. I want to set the terms. So that was the whole purpose behind that. And also realizing that, hey, if I feel this way, there's probably other poets. They're probably doing poetry and being like, I don't know how to control this. I don't have control over my art. I don't control how many people are reading it. So this is something that we want to be thinking about for ourselves as well. How can you, let me rephrase, what is the goal? Why are you doing what you're doing? Why do you want to have the impact that you want to have? And the sooner that you can have clarity on that, that's going to dictate a lot of our messaging and what we're going to need to lean into, which we'll discuss in the next episode of the Creative Companionship. How do people go from not knowing anything about you or who you are to becoming loyal to what it is that you offer them? What are you doing in your creative business to be consistent in your messaging? What is it about the offer that you have around poetry that no one else has even thought of? Today, we are continuing our discussion of Marty Neumeier's Zag to help you grow your own poetry business. Good morning, guys. Good evening. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Creative Companionship. This is our book club where we take business texts and try to apply them to poetry. To guide you in this process, there is me. Hello again. My name is Jeff with an O. I am a poet, and today we're going to be almost finishing up with Zag. We're going to have about 3 checkpoints left by the end of this video, but today we're going to be starting off with checkpoint 12 and moving forward from there. Checkpoint 12 is all about how are you spreading the word, and the example that Marty uses a lot again is going to be Apple. When you think about Apple, like an Apple advertisement or the Apple logo or the Apple store, you see a lot of general consistencies, right? You can kind of get the aesthetic. Like imagine if Apple were to open a hotel, you can kind of imagine already what that hotel would look like. It's probably going to be a little bit minimalistic, clean, maybe some bright colors and things like that. Modern. You want the same thing for whatever it is that you're creating. So you want to be very consistent in a couple of key areas that Marty identifies. You want to be consistent, for instance, in your messaging. What is the central message that your offer is trying to present to the world that people need to be aware of, that they can identify with you specifically? What are the images? What are the sounds that are also built with that? You know, I think of like, you know, some companies, what they do is they focus on smells, right? They're spending research dollars to be like, okay, we're going to create a smell that's consistent in all of our brick and mortar locations. So as soon as people walk in, they're going to identify that with us. Or you hear about, for instance, like Microsoft, when they're creating like their tablets, they spent a lot of dollars just on the specific sound it makes. For instance, if you detach your keyboard and then reattach it to your tablet, that specific sound, you know, they spent thousands, if not more dollars on just making sure that sound was right. So it's paying attention to those little details to create that consistent sense of who you are, what you're about, and what people can expect from you and everything else that you offer. With the verses, you know, again, some things we're talking about, our workshops, our presentations, our social media posts. What is something that we're constantly referring? Well, we're constantly referring to poetry and art, but also business. We're really the only poetry organization in the city that's doing that. Every other poetry organization in the city is focused on nonprofit. Even, for instance, the Creative Companionship. What's it about? We're looking at business books and then trying to apply it to poetry. It's the symbols that we're using. You know, we're even referring to things like corporate poetry. You know, we're trying to use a lot of this terminology from business, but also applying it to art in a way that's welcoming to poets. And so you want to be kind of thinking about that for your own creative projects, your own creative offers. How can you be consistent? From there, we can move on to checkpoint 13. Checkpoint 13 introduces concepts that were created by Kim and Malburn. So these were 2 researchers, and they created these concepts called blue ocean versus red ocean. Blue ocean is like open water. It's where no one else is there to compete with you. Red ocean, it's crowded. There's blood in the water. It's attracted a lot of sharks and things like that to feed. So we want to move towards blue ocean, which means that whatever it is that we're creating, whatever it is that's our poetry or artistic, creative offer into the world, it has to be something that no one else is doing. Again, it's that concept of if someone else is there, if someone else is competing there, we move away. We want to go where there is no competition. We're the only thing that people can turn to. So that means we really need to create something that's really unique. Again, with the case of the Verses, we're really the only platform in the city that's trying to get poets away from, for instance, nonprofit routes, submission routes, applying for grant routes. We're like, hey, no, we can earn it on our own. So everything we're doing is in that aim, and no one else is really doing that or talking about that in the city. Honestly, even extends beyond Ohio. Just in general, a lot of poets aren't considering that business aspect, but from a local level especially, it's really not there. So we're filling that gap, that area of need, right? So whatever it is that you're offering, if someone else is offering something comparable, don't do it. Do something else. Do it to make a change, to make sure that no one else is in that same space. Part of what this is going to also entail, as Marty describes, is we're going to have to avoid best practices. In the poetry world, what are some best practices? Well, you have to submit, you have to apply for MFAs, you have to get fellowships, you have to go to residencies, you have to go to retreats, you have to build up your publishing credentials. If you're a professor, then you're going to have to do research, you're going to have to do talks and things like that. You know, we're saying, hey, no, like you can actually just create your own offer. You don't have to submit. You don't have to apply to things. You can just go. And that's something that we're consistent about here as well. So we're trying to make sure we can connect in that way. As you're thinking about your offer, the next thing that you want to be thinking about, this is checkpoint 14 in the book. Again, this is Zag by Marty Neumeier. Checkpoint 14 is all about what do people experience when they become familiar with you. What is the actual experience that people are going to have? We mentioned the Apple brand earlier. So for instance, when you think about the Apple store, you already have an idea what that's going to look like in terms of the aesthetic. You know, if you think about like your favorite restaurant, you already kind of have an idea of what it's going to look like. You know, think of like even like a chain restaurant. Like you go to a McDonald's, you know what kind of to expect at McDonald's. There might be like double doors. You're going to open those. You're going to enter. There's probably going to be 2 or 3 kiosks where you can order. And then on the right, there's going to be the place, the register, you know, where you can also order there too. Or you can pick up your food. Around there is also probably going to be the place where you can get your drinks. And then there's going to be like a seating area. You know, that's a lot of your McDonald's are basically kind of following that format. You already kind of have an idea of the smell. You already know the menu is going to be, where that's going to be located and things like that. You already have an idea of the whole experience, but it can go beyond that too, right? So we can think about what's the journey that people go on to learn more about you, you know? So you can, one of the things that Marty recommends is you can actually map that journey. So mapping that journey could be, for instance, where do people first learn about you? How do people actually start kind of quote unquote enrolling with you, getting involved with the things that you offer? And then eventually, how do they become loyal to you versus other, again, I don't even want to competitors, but like other organizations that maybe are in the same industry as you, even if they're not directly competing with you. So what's that process? You want to map that out. So for instance, with the Verses, how are we reaching people? We're still really young for the Verses. You know, we're only pushing the business side in the last like year and a half, maybe 2 years. And so right now it's still very much about that exposure phase. So we do things like we offer retreats. I do things like having workshops. I do things like, for instance, having this video podcast. That's a book club as well, talking about books. We do have the YouTube channel. Some other things that we have for Diverses as well. You know, we have an event calendar in Columbus. It's on an Instagram group, so I just keep track of poetry events going on around the city, not just mine, but for everyone. It's supposed to be it's a community service. So even if other people are hosts, they can post their own events there too. We have a newsletter that's just focused on Diverses events. We have an actual poetry venue, like literally this space. We're the only poetry venue in the city right now. Okay, first one. Maybe the only one that's ever going to happen. I don't know. Hopefully we can change that, right? But, you know, these are all the ways that people are getting in touch with us, contacting us. They're part of the journey for the exposure, learning what they do. And you notice the other thing, too, with a lot of the things that we create, it's not just for me. Like, I could just read this book myself, but no, it's about how do we bring this knowledge to other people so that, you know, whether you're involved with me or not, you can still take the knowledge away and apply it to yourselves. You know, even if you don't go to my events, you can still join the event calendar to go to other poetry events in the city. You know, so it's constantly kind of asking yourself, okay, this thing that I'm offering, how can I make sure it's giving to whoever is receiving? It's not about me. It's about what are other people getting from it, and constantly putting that into perspective. One of the other things too, if you're working, for instance, with a physical space, we gave the McDonald's example. So one of the things with the diversus space, hey, we're not very big. What you're seeing is almost most of the space, honestly, right? But one of the things that people do encounter, they do see that we have the lighting set up. So there's like a key light back there that people can see. We have the cameras, we have the microphone set up and the equipment there. So people can see that, oh, we do a lot of production-based things. You also see this is, if you've ever seen like the other videos we have, we have a relatively long table that we use for workshops and things like that. We have quotes around the wall in relation to past workshops we've done, and also just kind of like the business mentality of poetry that we're bringing to it. So for instance, there's a poster behind us that says like rise and revise. Even for instance, like the art on the walls, we have these like little posters are taken from literary works, and they're designed with words. So that if you zoom out, if you look at it from afar, it just looks like it's a picture. But if you actually zoom in, it's like, oh wow, there's actually words here. So for instance, there's a picture over there that's like it's the Garden of Eden. Okay, there's the snake in a tree, but then like you zoom in, it's like, oh, this is actually the words from the book of Genesis actually put into there, right? So it's just little things like that to match everything. We're also located in a bookshop, perfect for a literary based company like the Verses. The last thing I want to mention before we head out is actually the first thing I should have mentioned, but I skipped it. So we're going to jump backwards to checkpoint 11. And checkpoint 11 is, how do you explain yourself? More specifically, there are two key concepts that Marty is focusing on here. There's a concept called a true line, and then there's a concept called a tagline. One example he gives is Southwest. So Southwest has the true line that Southwest believes that you can fly anywhere for cheaper than it takes to drive. And the tagline that they use is that you are now free to move about the country. So notice that the true line is kind of the central premise of the company. It's the whole focus of what is the key belief that we're operating under. The tagline takes that, tries to simplify it, and is kind of the central message that's actually said to people. So the true line is kind of the inspiration and the heart of the tagline. For instance, for the Verses, originally one of the things that, if you look at our old post, I really put everywhere was, the Verses is a guide for poets to achieve creative and financial independence. It's cool, but it's a little wordy and it sounds a little technical, right? So one of the things that you'll find now, for instance, you can see it when I send out the newsletters and stuff, you can see it on the website, is the tagline is just live on poetry. Because it's still going back to that central premise, right? It's how what does it mean to actually live on poetry, where I'm defining that as having creative and financial independence. Being able to do what you want, to live the way you want, while also creating how you want, right? But that's a lot of words, and so instead, just kind of simplifying it into the tagline that I can tell people is, hey, I help people live on poetry. What is the Verses? The Verses is all about living on poetry. And so a little tip that Marty gives is that when you're trying to, first of all, create your true line and then transition that into your tagline, the tagline you really want to be as simple, as short, and clean as possible. That means minimizing words like and, like, hey, if you can try to get your tagline to somewhere between 5 to 8 words, you're going to be in good shape. It's okay if your true line is a little bit longer than that, but trying to have a tagline that's quick, easy to remember, and easy to see applied. Alignment. How do people see the consistency across everything that you are saying? What do people get from actually joining you or being associated with you or your brand? If you're bonding with someone new, it helps to talk about things that you both like and enjoy. But a lot of times that connection gets a lot stronger when you both talk about things that you're against. If you want to make a business around your art, you're going to need to decide who is going to love your art and who is going to hate what you're doing with your work. Today, we are continuing our Creative Companionship Book Club dive into Zag by Marty Neumeier. This is a book that is all about branding, and we're talking about how can we apply the lessons from this book to our own creative business. Hello, guys. My name, once more, is Jeff with an O. I'm a poet, and we are today going to be taking a look at checkpoints 7, 8, 9, and 10 from Zag. The very first thing that Marty's going to be talking about in checkpoint 7 is discussing a concept that you need to be considering in your messaging, in your service, or your offer, or your product, whatever it is that you're putting out into your world from the perspective of your creative business, is you need to be thinking about what is your alignment. How do people see the consistency across everything that you are saying? Okay. Alignment has to really deal with every single behavior, the posting, the font, the messaging, the product itself, the person that you're aiming at. One of the things that can happen, and I've seen this in my own businesses, is that when you are creating products and putting them into the world, it's very easy to build new things. It's very easy to say, hey, I'm going to add this. I'm going to add this. I'm going to add this. I'm going to put this out. I'm going to put this out. And Marty makes a really great point in saying that, when we put something out, you want to also be considering the alignment, but you also want to kind of consider who is the competition, because a lot of times if you're putting this new thing out, you may now be competing with something else that another business is creating, and maybe they're better at it, maybe they're better known for it, maybe they have better resources towards it. And so if you do want to create something new, make sure then that it is something that is not in competition with something else, because if it is with something that is in competition with something else, you maybe want to reconsider. Because once you start a new offer, a new product, or a new service, and it's out there, that's resources, that's time, that's commitment on your part that you're putting into it. And if it's not going to be something that's sustainable for the long term, then maybe that energy and that resource and that money would have been better spent trying to put it towards something that you can sustain. So again, think about how can people be aware of what you're doing on a consistent basis by everything you bring to the table. With the verses, we're so big on the poetry game in terms of the craft development side. We have the workshops to develop poets and things like that. But why are we doing that? We're not just doing it to develop poets, but because also from a business perspective side, we need poets to be able to produce work of the quality that people are looking for when we incorporate with other services. So for instance, if I'm creating poetry from a communication standpoint, I need to make sure that the poets or the poems I'm writing are at a level where they can be of benefit as a tool for a communication device and things like that. So it's not just, when we're offering craft lessons, it's not purely just to elevate craft, it's to elevate craft with a specific goal. You can see also, for instance, with our social media posting, we're doing a lot of things that we'll reference in a moment where we're trying to position ourselves that, hey, we are trying to help poets be independent, not be relying on things like grants or outside organizations. We can create things around our own work to sustain ourselves. And so one of the ways we're doing that with a lot of our posting is we're comparing ourselves with the traditional routes. What is it like if you go through a submission process and you have to wait a long time to hear back, or you're spending money for people to read your work and things like that. We're constantly pointing those things out to be in alignment with the types of services that we create. Another quick example of the importance of alignment. He has lots of examples in the book. I was thinking of examples on my end as well. I was thinking about Mercedes. So Mercedes, you have this car company that's known for high-end cars, luxury cars, expensive cars. But, one of the things that they've done in more recent decades is they started creating other cars that are cheaper, and yeah, you enter a new price point to get more sales. But here's the thing. Some people are originally going to Mercedes because they associate Mercedes with kind of like the high-end thing. But how can you be the high-end thing but then also sell another car, in that like 20 to 30 grand category, versus other luxury high-end cars don't have that option, so people suddenly you're kind of splitting your market a bit. Because people that are purely going for, I only want like the high-end car, well, maybe I'm not going to consider Mercedes as much because, they also do that other stuff. I just want a company that's just focused on the single thing. Going back to the verses too about some of the other things that we're doing that I think are in alignment with this mission of, living on poetry. What are all the things we have? We got like merch. Like, look, we got like the banners. We got like the hat, the sweatshirts and things. We've got the idea that poetry. We're constantly looking at how can we use poetry as a vehicle for something else. Incorporating poetry in classes for communication, for instance, on my end with my communication business. It's the idea that, hey, we're literally renting a space. No other poets are really renting spaces. It's a commercial space. We're located in a bookshop. So building that connection between poetry and business again. I'm hiring poets. In our substation, our online community, where poets can get poems edited, they can do peer review, they can go to workshops online and in person. Lots of different poetry resources. I've hired poets. We got Ajane Dawkins and we got Dr. Violeta Orozco. I've literally hired them. I'm paying poets to edit people's work and look at people's work. These are all things that, again, are in alignment with poetry and business. We have, for instance, the Arts and Offers video podcast. It's a video podcast talking about art and business. We have this episode of the Creative Companionship. It's a book club that looks at texts that are more business related, so that way we can apply it to creative and artistic and poetry endeavors. All of these things, again, in alignment with the broader goal. So whatever you create, how can you be in alignment with it? That's the big takeaway. From there, we get to checkpoint 8. Checkpoint 8 is all about who loves you. Who are the people that want to see you succeed and are invested in it themselves? He gives the example of looking at like a local coffee shop versus a Starbucks in his neighborhood. And why do people go to a local shop versus Starbucks? Well, a lot of people don't go to Starbucks purely because Starbucks is the corporate chain. So that's actually one asset that makes the local coffee shop more valuable, is that we are not that thing with the positioning. People go there because they love the idea of supporting something that's local and in the community. Marty gives some questions that you can consider if you're trying to think about, who are the people that actually love you. So, for instance, you want to be asking yourself, what do people get from actually joining you or being associated with you or your brand? What do your employees get? If you're hiring people, what do they get? So, for instance, when I hired like Violeta and when I hired Ajane, they're really excited. I can't pay them what I would love to pay them right now, but part of the reason why they joined it is because they just like the mission of helping poets in their journeys, in their growth and development. What do people who are adjacent to you get? So, for instance, we're here. One thing immediately, so this is a bookshop, but the owner of the bookshop isn't able to spend a lot of time here. So one of the things, by renting this space from the bookshop owner, I'm giving him some income from the bookshop and helping it stay a little bit more solvent, right? But then it also, it brings people to the neighborhood. It helps people associate this part of the city. This is the west side of Columbus. The west side of Columbus doesn't have a ton of like artistic things. The poetry shows, especially in regards to poetry, there's not a lot of poetry events happening on this side of town, but this brings something to this area, right? What do families get? What do the neighbors get? What do customers get? These are the things that you want to be considering, because the more you're able to give to all of those different areas of your community, the more people are going to want to be involved with you. And so it gets to this idea that, a brand is actually, it's a contribution to the ecosystem. And in fact, this ecosystem itself is built on contribution. So a brand is a contribution to an ecosystem built on contribution. That's checkpoint 8. Moving from checkpoint 8 to checkpoint 9, we go from love to the other side. Who is your enemy? This is something I mentioned many times before. This is something that you can see in lots of branding books, marketing books, things like that. Is we got to position ourselves against something. It's something I talk to people a lot about, is how if you're bonding with someone new, it helps to talk about things that you both like and enjoy. But a lot of times that connection gets a lot stronger when you both talk about things that you're against, things you hate, things that you really dislike. It's the negative reaction. You can use it as a way for growth and actual positivity. So to give examples, you can compare like Apple, standing in opposition to IBM, and traditional computers. You can look at, for instance, like Trader Joe's going against traditional supermarkets like Kroger. You can look at, for instance, like Motel 6s going up against like Hyatt's. You can look at Mini Coopers, like smaller cars going up against your larger SUV. The key thing is that you want to give points that can differentiate you from what everyone else is doing. The more that we're able to do that, the more people are going to associate us with the things we want them to associate us with. So ask yourself, who are you against? In the case of Diverses, the enemy I've named is corporate poetry. Who's corporate poetry? When we think of corporate, we think of things that are kind of like sanitized, procedural, larger organizations. There's a lot of corporate poetry in the world, right? Most of your big poetry journals, that's corporate poetry. People that, they're getting the large grant funding, not like the $1,000 grants. These are the organizations getting like the $500,000 to millions of dollars in grant funding. These are corporate poets. Corporate poetry also can refer to the poets that are going through the traditional system, the poets that are going through, your traditional submissions and getting solicited from those big journals and winning a lot of times your prestigious literary awards. A lot of times those are people who are in the corporate poetry industry, field, and academia and things like that. So that's who Diverses is positioning herself against, because we're trying to be, we're not the corporate. We're not going for corporate poetry. We're going for independent poetry. Poets who have found ways to bring their art into the world on their own terms, not on the terms of gatekeepers and larger organizations and things like that. We have the control. We're not deferring control to others. So who is your own enemy when you're creating your product, when you're creating your service, when you're creating your offer around poetry or your art? Who's the enemy of that? The final checkpoint I want to get to from Marty is checkpoint 10, which is the name. Obviously, you need to think of a name that people are going to call whatever it is, the business that you're creating. The example that Marty gives, before we get into some specific guidelines for names, he gives the examples of two companies. These aren't real companies. One company is called Personal Media Devices, and another company is called UBOP. Both of them sell personal electronics, like MP3 players and stuff like that. Who's going to do better long term? Personal Media Devices or UBOP? Well, Personal Media Devices makes the argument that when people hear the name, they know exactly what they're going to get. It tells people exactly the type of product that they create. One of the problems with that name is other companies can replicate it pretty easily. Personal media devices, you can make like personal devices, or personal media. Like there's lots of different offshoots that people could create that could suddenly be in competition with you very, very quickly, versus UBOP is such a unique name in the space that, you hear UBOP, you don't exactly know at first what it's about. Maybe with the bop, you can start thinking about the music and things like that if you're doing like MP3 players, but it's not immediately clear what it's about, which also makes it harder to copy in the space. And that's just one quick example of things that you want to be thinking about for names. He has, again, some points that you want to consider. 7 tips for names from Marty Neumeier. He says that if you're making a name for a company, you want to be thinking about something that is unique. Again, look at UBOP. Short, again, look at UBOP. 2 syllables. Not generic. UBOP, I've never heard of a company named that before, right? Easy to spell. UBOP, I guess the question could be, is it Y-O-U or is it just Y-U? But in general, you can get an idea of how to spell it. Acoustics. You want to have something that is pleasant to say and pronounce. Brand play. Are there things that you can play around with? Like, for instance, like he gave the example for UBOP. People, part of the slogans for that could be like Who-bop, UBOP, or like things like that. A final one is that you want to make sure you have a name that's legally defensible. For our own poetry endeavors, the big brand for me is Diverses. Diverses, it plays with a couple of things, right? It has the idea of like diverse, like deviation, but it also has verses, like the poetic device, right? It has the idea of deviating, trying something new. You're varying your approach and things like that. So these are all things that diverse is just with the name that it gets at on multiple levels. Also, 3 syllables. People are familiar with how to spell diverse. People are familiar with how to spell verses. So diverse is even just saying like diverse with an S or things like that. So it's relatively easy to get people to spell it, pronounce it, and say it. It's a word that people have some familiarity with, but adding the S to it changes it in a new way. So these are all the things that I was thinking about, when I was picking my name. You want to be thinking about how can you answer those 7 questions yourself. The concept of living on your passion. There have never been more tools and more opportunities to do so. Purpose and vision. What's the difference between those? There's a couple questions that you can answer. There's a what, a how, a who, a where, a why, and a when. Does my story sound like yours? I have heard so many times that it's possible to live on your passion, and recently I've taken the dive to try to make that happen with poetry. And if that sounds like something you're interested in trying to do too, or some sort of art or whatever it is that interests you, you want to make a life around it and put it at the forefront instead of on the back burner, well, this video is for you. This is the Creative Companionship book club, where we take a look at business texts and try to apply them to the context of art and poetry to guide you in this process. Again, my name is Jeff with an O, and I am a poet. We are returning to Marty Neumeier's Zag. This is a textbook that is all about radical differentiation. How do you separate yourself from others so that way you're not competing with anyone because what you offer is so unique. We're in part 3. Marty has introduced a 17-point checklist that we are moving through. And today we're going to be starting right around number 4, if I have it right. And what he's talking about, actually no, this is checkpoint number 3. And this is where he is talking about things like purpose and vision. What's the difference between those? Well, purpose he has as being something that's a little bit more abstract, whereas vision is something that suddenly can turn that into something that's a little bit more concrete. The example he gives is actually an example given by Peter Senge, where he points to Kennedy during the 60s. What was the purpose? Well, one of the things that they were doing was the space race, right? So the purpose you could have written as advancing to explore the heavens. But what was the actual vision of that? Well, something that was more tangible was we're going to put a man on the moon by 1970. So again, the bigger overarching thing is, hey, we're going to explore the heavens. The actual way we're going to demonstrate that, though, is, hey, we're going to put a man onto the moon for the first time. So when you're trying to think about this and create something that's more tangible for yourself and separating it from the overarching purpose that you have, you want to think about things you can actually deliver. It may be helpful to write this down in a brochure or a script or even maybe a little bit of a speech. Once you have that down about what you see happening, you can then read through it, show it to other people, try to identify some flaws with it, and then you can think about the tangible offer. To give an example for the verses is all about trying to help poets achieve their own creative and financial independence. We are trying to literally live on poetry. So how do we do that? Well, one of the things that we talk about is we host workshops, we have trainings, we offer retreats. One of the things that we're going to be pushing in 2026 is trying to tie everything together into a module under a branch that we call the Poet Business Institute. The module is going to have a craft arm, so that way we can improve our poetry. And we already have that with our online forum at the substation, where people can edit poems. We also have like the Craft Write workshop series as well, which again, if you're a substation member, you can check out. In addition to that, I really think that education is key. I think teaching is a way that you can better refine your own views, and you can also help people to achieve more than they currently can as well. And so trying to guide poets to become better teachers for whatever it is they want to teach. For instance, I'm a communications coach. I use poetry with my communication students. We're doing that several times a week because, hey, as we go through this process, I want to show people that I'm living the thing. I'm actually doing the thing I am describing, not just talking about it. So that's one way I do that. I teach people communication and pronunciation in different devices to become more effective communicators. In addition to the education arm, we need a content arm. So I literally have rented this space. This is where we do our recording. This is where we have our audio production, our lighting, our cameras, and things like that. This is where we create reality poetry shows like the listening room. And then finally, what we need to do is we need to develop and hone in on a specific area. So the poets need to become better communicators too. So we talk about strategies for increasing your own poetic performance, but also having a specific idea that you can vocalize to the world and creating things around that and expressing it in a way that is articulate and clear and effective. So those are all the things that we are literally doing. The big picture for the vision is, honestly, we need a whole center. This space is great for where we are right now, but if Kennedy had that vision of, hey, we're going to put a man on the moon by 1970, the vision for me is, hey, I would love by 2030 to have an actual space with a separate classroom, a separate content production arm, and also have poets out there doing their thing, living independently, or at least starting to be on that path. The next checkpoint that Marty has is checkpoint 4, which is something that we've already mentioned earlier, trends. Trends are helpful not because they are necessary. You can do all the work without a trend, but Marty explains that with a trend, it can increase your velocity. It makes it easier for people to attach you to concepts and understand what it is exactly that you are about. I'm thinking about, for Diverses, what are some big trends? And we talked about this before, but one that I think I missed a lot and something I've been seeing a lot online on the socials is the movement against AI in the creative space. So a lot of poets, writers, artists are really going anti-AI. And I think that Diverses, learning how to become independent through your work, finding ways to create your own avenues to succeed, is one way that you can actually stand out against AI. So I think we can push against that arm a lot. In addition, things like video production, audio production, podcasting, channels, social media, and things. This is another area where a lot of poets are thinking about it, even if they don't necessarily like it. We actually just talked about that in the Arts and Offers podcast. Other things, open mics in the slam community. So those in-person experiences and events, as people get jaded with what's happening in the online spaces, these in-person experiences are going to become increasingly important. And also just the concept of living on your passion. There have never been more tools and more opportunities to do so. And so Diverses can capitalize on the movement that people have towards that, trying to find ways to take things that people do on the side and actually put them at the forefront of your life. Once this checkpoint is done, Marty moves on to the checkpoint 5, which we've talked about before as well in the Arts and Offers podcast, which is Zipf's law, one of the power laws. It's the idea that if you are in first place, you get twice as many opportunities as whoever is in second place. And second place gets twice as many opportunities as whoever is in third place. The big impact of this is that if you're not number one, then honestly, it's going to be very hard for you to compete. There can be some space for number 2, but anything beyond that, you really want to be thinking about where is your uniqueness? Where is the place where I can insert myself and no one else can compete with me? I can be the best in this area. Where can I be the leader? One of the things that they talk about in this checkpoint as well, Marty mentions things that he refers to as hubs. Hubs are places where there really isn't a ton of competition that can survive. He points to, in terms of operating systems, Microsoft Windows is by and large worldwide the dominant system. He points to Adobe for their documents and their PDFs, areas like that. So, once you're able to reach a place where it doesn't make sense for other people to enter because what you provide is honestly kind of perfect for a situation, or people don't feel like they need an alternative, then it becomes even harder to replace you. He also gives some descriptions about leaders and when leaders receive the most favor from people. And I'll just highlight that list really quick that he has. He says leaders are going to be favored in an industry when there's confusion. So he points to cell phones. You know, cell phones have all kinds of features and things like that. So people a lot of times are just going to go with the leading name. You know, I think the leading name a lot of times you hear are Apple, obviously with the iPhone, and maybe like Samsung Galaxy. I don't know what the current phones. There's obviously lots of other phones too, but those are the ones I feel like you hear thrown around a lot. Leaders are also going to be favored when comparisons are hard. You can look at different agencies, you know, insurance agencies, sales and marketing agencies, things like that. The leader is going to be favored when price is high. So, for instance, for cars. Leaders are going to be favored too when the interest for the item is low. He gives the example of table salt. How many salt companies can you name? Morton's? Maybe McCormick? I don't know if I can name any others. Leaders are going to be favored when standards are necessary. He points again to operating systems like Windows. Leaders are going to be favored when the benefits aren't tangible. He mentions like wealth services, for instance, those provided by banks. Leaders are going to be favored when the features are technical. He points to the drug industry, pharmaceuticals. He posits that leaders are going to be favored when risk is really high. For instance, lawyers. You don't want to lose your case, so you get the best lawyer you can find. Think like also maybe surgeons, doctors. Lastly, he says leaders are going to be favored when the desire is prestige. So when you can give increased status to people. So as you're thinking about how you can apply this checkpoint to yourself in your own creative business, you want to be thinking about what can you be the first to come to mind for, and also how can you become popular for your specific, the specific area you're filling. So for instance, for the verses being the first to guide poets to creative and financial independence. I can speak, for instance, in Columbus. I don't know any other poet that is as heavy on trying to create a business around poetry. I know poets that are big in like nonprofit. I know people that have like nonprofit spaces and grants and things like that, but I don't know anyone that's really pushing to help poets make it on their own terms. The last checkpoint we're going to be talking about today is Marty's checkpoint number 6, where you want to describe yourself with only. And the phrase he gives you to try to use is, we are the only blank that blank. To give an example using the verses as a model, there's a couple questions that you can answer. There's a what, a how, a who, a where, a why, and a when. The what. The verses is the only poetry institute. How? That builds education linking business with poetry. Who? For poets who want to live on art. Where? In Columbus and online. Why? To push poetry from the side to the forefront of your life. When? In an era with the most tools to live on passion. One thing you'll note is that he has some examples in the book as well. And again, the book we're looking at is Zag by Marty Neumeier. He gives some examples for when, and all the whens start with in an era blanks that may help you if you try to fill this out and create your own list. What are your own answers to any of these checkpoints? Share them in the comments, and we'll see you in the next episode of Creative Companionship.